Welcome and thank you for attending today's session with Annette and Brian Mader on enhancing employability for persons with FASD. Before I introduce Annette and Brian, there are a few housekeeping tips. All sites have been muted at the bridge, but please be sure that your mics are also muted. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please let your local site contact know and they will follow up accordingly. If you have any questions for the presenter during the session, you can email Erin Day at erin.day@gov.ab.ca. If you have questions for the presenter after the session, his or her contact information can be found at the back of your handouts. Evaluations for this session will be emailed to participants, so please be sure to sign the attendance sheet. We're pleased to let everyone know that today's session has 40 sites attending and there are over 100 participants today. Education and training is a critical aspect in the Government of Alberta's FASD 10-year strategic plan that is addressed through various initiatives such as video conferencing learning series. We're pleased with the ongoing interest and attendance in this initiative. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Annette and Brian. Annette R. Cutknife is a single parent of Daniel Cutknife, who has been diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. She's the FASD coordinator for Samson Cree and began advocating and sharing her experience with fetal alcohol syndrome in May of 1998. She wanted to make a difference by sharing her story and experience regarding this very sensitive issue. Since making an appearance at the Canada Northwest FASD conference in November of 2003 in Winnipeg, Annette has been given opportunities to travel provincially and nationally. She's made a presentation in 2005 at the Canada Northwest FASD conference in Regina, Saskatchewan, and Annette has also been a conference committee member for the Alberta FASD conference in 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010, as well as on the 2008 Canada Northwest FASD conference, which was held in Banff, Alberta. Brian Mader has worked for Alberta Employment and Immigration for 25 years as a career consultant. The last 20 years, Brian has worked as a career counselor and has specialized in working with youth and adults with disabilities. Brian has been involved with individuals with FASD since 1992 and has co-chaired the Region 6 Adults with FASD subcommittee for 4 years. Brian has spoken at various local, provincial, and interprovincial conferences on enhancing employment and life management for persons with FASD. During the presentation, Brian will be interviewing Annette's son, Daniel Cutknife, who is a 21-year-old young adult living with FASD disability. He's an only child, graduated grade 12 from the Wetaskiwin Composite High School in 2008 from the remedial learning class. Daniel is a public speaker, enjoys video games, and participates in the Special Olympics Bowling League, playing 10-pin. As well, Daniel is now attending Horizon Center in Wetaskiwin. Now, please join me in welcoming Annette Cutknife and Brian Mader.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm going to get Brian up here to just make himself visible. And we'll carry on with our presentation.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, Brian is going to be assisting whenever there's a chance where we're going to be speaking about the brain or anything that he feels that it's important to elaborate, and especially when it comes to employability of FASD individuals. I have been speaking about this disability now for going on 12 years, and I owe a lot of my opportunities being exposed to public speaking to our former chief, Victor Buffalo. He had asked me to speak once, and I haven't stopped since. And my contribution for this sensitive topic is from a birth parent's perspective. And my main goal is to prevent this from happening to others, as it is 100% preventable through awareness, healing, and education. And what I have gone through and what I'm still currently going through regarding medical issues, anything to do with school or areas where I need to advocate. It's something that I wouldn't wish upon anybody, which is why I do what I do in educating everyone about it, especially the young women who are in their childbearing years, to definitely think twice before they take that first drink. Enhancing employability for persons with FASD. Introduction. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder can affect all races and cultures. It is not only an Aboriginal issue. However, I do know in my region, in my reserve of Samson Cree, the statistics is increasing very rapidly, and I do want everyone to know that it is not just an Aboriginal issue, it is an international problem. Hopefully all cultures and races of the world will become educated about FASD. And now we're going to get into the brain of this presentation, where we'll be talking about the brain. And Brian will also be doing a lot of the co-facilitating in this area. And we're starting off with the cerebellum.
The total brain through exposure to alcohol is affected. But there are some systems that they've done research on that are more affected than other areas. So the areas that we usually focus on are some of the salient areas that really affect sort of the brain and the behavior of the individual. The cerebellum is a part of the brain at the back of the brain that is involved in motor and cognitive functioning. People who have damage to cerebellum often will have a hard time controlling their movements. I tell the story of when I was in Vancouver a couple of years ago at one of the conferences for FAS. I saw a young fellow from Alaska. He was 12 years old. He looked significantly younger, but he had cerebellum damage in as much as basically his arms and legs all went different directions at the same time. He had ataxia. He was in crutches. So basically his ability to control his motor movements was impaired. But the cerebellum also, more recently when I was down at the National Academy of Neuroscience conference in Phoenix, but what we are aware of now is the cerebellum also plays a major role in smoothing out not only muscle movements, but smoothing out thinking. So the cerebellum is directly wired through the basal ganglia to the prefrontal cortex. And it helps in effect of smoothing out our thinking, making us, able to think thoughts in a smooth and rational fashion. So the cerebellum, when we have people who have this type of damage, not only is it going to be through things like ataxias, but it will affect their cognitive ability to think about things. Part and parcel of that, the basal ganglia are a set of nerve cells that also take a look at motor abilities and cognitive functions. And like the cerebellum, I went to one workshop where a person, Len Koziol from Philadelphia, traced the actual circuitry from the prefrontal cortex through the basal ganglia to the cerebellum, and he showed that damage in this area really affects a person's ability, their cognitive ability to think and to think smoothly. So there's a whole circuitry section that often is affected by alcohol in utero. Types of behaviors that this results in are things like perseveration. And I always say to people, well, it's really great when you have people who persevere. However, perseveration is really a negative idea. It's getting fixed on one strategy and continuously using that strategy without the ability to vary our thinking. So people with FASD often perseverate on things. So this can be perseverative ideas and perseverative behaviors. And once again, that's the whole idea, is that they cannot switch their thinking. They cannot problem solve in a fluid fashion. They get stuck on one idea. The inability to switch modes, which I've talked about. Basal ganglia is also involved in the ability to set and work, to set goals and work towards them. And predicting behavioral outcomes. So damage to the basal ganglia often will result in people that are very unpredictable. In fact, one of my colleagues, Dr. Val Massey, always says, the only thing predictable about FASD is its unpredictability, right? So we have many people that are affected by alcohol in utero who are totally unpredictable. And I often liken this to these are the people that go through our society who are like loose cannons. And if you know the whole expression loose cannons, it was come from the British Navy. It was a cannon that on a ship that was loose that would, after the recoil, would create great havoc because it was not tied down. And in fact, people with FASD, unsupported in our society, often are like these loose cannons. Often they do create great havoc because they're not fully supported as they need to be. And the other area that we often talk about with FASD is the ability to perceive and manage time. I will also, with many of my clients, what I see is that they have no concept of time. And I used to think, well, okay, what causes this? You know, is this just a behavior that we're noticing, that they're just sort of not noticing the passage of time? And you know, what I began to realize is many of my clients actually had an organic issue with time. They don't notice the passage of time because of damage in the basal ganglia. So one example is I had a client who used to come to my office, and she would come usually if her appointment was 2 in the afternoon, which I would go through and tell her, and I'd write it down and all this sort of thing. She would come at 9 in the morning and sit in my waiting room until her appointment at 2. And what she would say to me, and I would go out and see her, and I said, gee, your appointment's not till 2. Why are you here at 9 o'clock? And what she would say is, well, basically, I can't remember when my appointment was. I remember the day, but I can't remember the hour. The other issue with many of these individuals is even when you do set appointments with them, they'll often not show. So I have another client, Tim, who basically, I've made a deal with him. Anytime he shows up at my office, I'll spend 15 minutes to actually kind of see what his issues are and see what I can do to help him. I can book appointments with Tim, which for some reason, maybe this is my learning ability, I book appointments with Tim, but invariably he misses them. And somewhere in that week that I've booked, he'll show up in my office, usually at about 8:30 in the morning. And that's when Tim is not in jail. He has a real organic issue with the passage of time. He does not perceive time the same way that you and I perceive time. Another area of the brain that's affected by alcohol is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an organ in the brain that helps in memory. Often what neuroscientists will tell us is that the hippocampus actually tags most of what we store in our memory system with an emotional tone to it. So people with FASD often have damage in this area. So damage to the fibers in the hippocampus and cell reduction, a reduced hippocampal kind of volume. This affects not only the issue around memory, but it also affects things like mood regulation for them. And remember what I said, memory often is tagged with an emotional overlay. That's how we remember things. So when you kind of experience something and you file it in your filing system, it has an emotional coloration to you, to the memory that you often can retrieve through the emotion, and it will bring back the event. People with FASD often can't tag things and cannot necessarily respond to things the same way that a person with an undamaged brain would look at.
Okay. Thank you. The differences in the brain. Are you going to discuss the normal brain there versus the FASD affected brain?
Sure. This is a picture of 2 brains that were autopsied by Dr. Sterling Claren. And most of you who are familiar with FASD know Sterling Claren. It's 2 infants who had died. One brain, the brain on my right, is a grossly abnormal brain. What we can see is that it's smaller, it's smoother, and it has less convolutions. The other brain looks normal, but for whatever reason the infant wasn't able to survive because there were other health conditions. Now, what we usually say is the grossly abnormal brain here, the smaller brain, the smoother brain, is the rarer case. Most people with FASD will have brains that look normal but do not function normal, right? So they'll often have brains that look very much like the better brain here, with normal convolutions, with a lot of bumps in it, you know. But what it won't do is it won't function like other people's brains. And this is really important because the FASD brain, the one that's fully abnormal here, is the rarer event. Most people with FASD will have normal shape and size brain, but they will not function normally. And a lot of this is due to the fact that the damage is in both the gray matter and the white matter of the brain. And the tracts and the filaments and the circuitry of the brain is damaged, and it does not function like a normal brain.
Thank you, Brian. And that is what I usually share as well with the prenatal clients. When they look at this picture, they think, oh my goodness, I certainly am so worried about having a brain look like that. And then, you know, I explain to them that most of the brains look normal, but they just do not run the way they should be. Differences in effects. Alcohol exposure affects some people more than others. Some people with FASD are able to live productively on their own, while other people with FASD will need constant supervision. At this point in time in my son's life, Daniel, he does need that constant supervision. And he will be getting that constant supervision for at least another 5 years. And now we're going to get into the brain of this presentation, where we'll be talking about the brain. And Brian will also be doing a lot of the co-facilitating in this area. And we're starting off with the cerebellum.
The total brain, through exposure to alcohol, is affected. But there are some systems that they've done research on that are more affected than other areas. So the areas that we usually focus on are some of the salient areas that really affect sort of the brain and the behavior of the individual. The cerebellum is a part of the brain at the back of the brain that is involved in motor and cognitive functioning. People who have damage to cerebellum often will have a hard time controlling their movements. I tell the story of when I was in Vancouver a couple of years ago. At one of the conferences for FAS, I saw a young fellow from Alaska. He was 12 years old. He looked significantly younger, but he had cerebellum damage in as much as basically his arms and legs all went different directions at the same time. He had ataxia. He was in crutches. So basically his ability to control his motor movements was impaired. But the cerebellum also, more recently when I was down at the National Academy of Neuroscience conference in Phoenix, what we are aware of now is the cerebellum also plays a major role in smoothing out not only muscle movements, but smoothing out thinking. So the cerebellum is directly wired through the basal ganglia to the prefrontal cortex. And it helps in effect of smoothing out our thinking, making us, able to think thoughts in a smooth and rational fashion. So the cerebellum, when we have people who have this type of damage, not only is it going to be through things like ataxias, but it will affect their cognitive ability to think about things. Part and parcel of that, the basal ganglia, are a set of nerve cells that also take a look at motor abilities and cognitive functions. And like the cerebellum, I went to one workshop where a person, Len Koziol from Philadelphia, traced the actual circuitry from the prefrontal cortex through the basal ganglia to the cerebellum. And he showed that damage in this area really affects a person's ability, their cognitive ability to think and to think smoothly. So there's a whole circuitry section that often is affected by alcohol in utero. Types of behaviors that this results in are things like perseveration. And I always say to people, well, it's really great when you have people who persevere. However, perseveration is really a negative idea. It's getting fixed on one strategy and continuously using that strategy without the ability to vary our thinking. So people with FASD often perseverate on things. So this can be perseverative ideas and perseverative behaviors. And once again, that's the whole idea, is that they cannot switch their thinking. They cannot problem solve in a fluid fashion. They get stuck on one idea. The inability to switch modes, which I've talked about. Basal ganglia is also involved in the ability to set and work, to set goals and work towards them, and predicting behavioral outcomes. So damage to the basal ganglia often will result in people that are very unpredictable. In fact, one of my colleagues, Dr. Val Massey, always says, the only thing predictable about FASD is its unpredictability, right? So we have many people that are affected by alcohol in utero who are totally unpredictable. And I often liken this to, these are the people that go through our society who are like loose cannons. And if you know the whole expression loose cannons, it was come from the British Navy. It was a cannon that on a ship that was loose that would, after the recoil, would create great havoc because it was not tied down. And in fact, people with FASD, unsupported in our society, often are like these loose cannons. Often they do create great havoc because they're not fully supported as they need to be. And the other area that we often talk about with FASD is the ability to perceive and manage time. I will also, with many of my clients, what I see is that they have no concept of time. And I used to think, well, okay, what causes this? You know, is this just a behavior that we're noticing, that they're just sort of not noticing the passage of time? And you know, what I began to realize is many of my clients actually had an organic issue with time. They don't notice the passage of time because of damage in the basal ganglia. So one example is I had a client who used to come to my office, and she would come, usually if her appointment was 2 in the afternoon, which I would go through and tell her, and I'd write it down and all this sort of thing. She would come at 9 in the morning and sit in my waiting room until her appointment at 2. And what she would say to me, and I would go out and see her, and I said, gee, your appointment's not till 2. Why are you here at 9 o'clock? And what she would say is, well, basically, I can't remember when my appointment was. I remember the day, but I can't remember the hour. The other issue with many of these individuals is even when you do set appointments with them, they'll often not show. So I have another client, Tim, who basically, I've made a deal with him. Anytime he shows up at my office, I'll spend 15 minutes to actually kind of see what his issues are and see what I can do to help him. I can book appointments with Tim, which for some reason, maybe this is my learning ability, I book appointments with Tim, but invariably he misses them. And somewhere in that week that I've booked, he'll show up in my office, usually at about 8:30 in the morning. And that's when Tim is not in jail. He has a real organic issue with the passage of time. He does not perceive time the same way that you and I perceive time. Another area of the brain that's affected by alcohol is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an organ in the brain that helps in memory. Often what neuroscientists will tell us is that the hippocampus actually tags most of what we store in our memory system with an emotional tone to it. So people with FASD often have damage in this area. So damage to the fibers in the hippocampus and cell reduction, a reduced hippocampal kind of volume. This affects not only the issue around memory, but it also affects things like mood regulation for them. And remember what I said, memory often is tagged with an emotional overlay that's how we remember things. So when you kind of experience something and you file it in your filing system, it has an emotional coloration to you, to the memory that you often can retrieve through the emotion, and it will bring back the event. People with FASD often can't tag things and cannot necessarily respond to things the same way that a person with an undamaged brain would look at.
Okay. Thank you. The differences in the brain. Are you going to discuss the normal brain there versus the FASD affected brain?
Sure. This is a picture of two brains that were autopsied by Dr. Sterling Claren. And most of you who are familiar with FASD know Sterling Claren. It's two infants who had died. One brain, the brain on my right, is a grossly abnormal brain. What we can see is that it's smaller, it's smoother, and it has less convolutions. The other brain looks normal, but for whatever reason, the infant wasn't able to survive because there were other health conditions. Now, what we usually say is the grossly abnormal brain here, the smaller brain, the smoother brain, is the rarer case. Most people with FASD will have brains that look normal but do not function normal, right? So they'll often have brains that look very much like the better brain here, with normal convolutions, with a lot of bumps in it, but what it won't do is it won't function like other people's brains. And this is really important because the FASD brain, the one that's fully abnormal here, is the rarer event. Most people with FASD will have normal shape and size brain, but they will not function normally. And a lot of this is due to the fact that the damage is in both the gray matter and the white matter of the brain. And the tracts and the filaments and the circuitry of the brain is damaged, and it does not function like a normal brain.
Thank you, Brian. And that is what I usually share as well with the prenatal clients. When they look at this picture, they think, oh my goodness, I certainly am so worried about having a brain look like that. And then, I explain to them that most of the brains look normal, but they just do not run the way they should be. Differences in effects. Alcohol exposure affects some people more than others. Some people with FASD are able to live productively on their own, while other people with FASD will need constant supervision. At this point in time in my son's life, Daniel, he does need that constant supervision. And he will be getting that constant supervision for at least another 5 years. Now we're going into the adolescent and adults living with the FASD disability. Some of those characteristics would be troubles with learning and understanding, being very impulsive, which has a lot to do with the cause and effect thinking. That is just totally absent. They will just go ahead and do something without thinking what could happen. Difficulties dealing with people, poor judgment, troubles with sexual decisions. Now we're looking at the developmental time frames in FASD for someone who is 18 years old. His expressive language would appear to be that of a 20-year-old, and that is because they copy and mimic what they hear. They don't necessarily know what it is that they're saying. Their comprehension level is at a 6-year-old level. Their money and time concepts would be that of an 8-year-old. Their emotional maturity would be that of a 6-year-old, and that would be having meltdowns or getting very upset over the simplest thing, making mountains out of molehills. Physical maturity, that of an 18-year-old or less. They're often viewed upon as little boys in men's bodies or little girls in women's bodies. their reading ability, that of a 16-year-old, but in a lot of cases that I've seen, that the clients I've worked with, I often see it at a much, much lower level. Social skills, that of a 7-year-old. Living skills, that of an 11-year-old. They are not ready to be on their own, obviously, at 18 or 21. A more realistic time frame for them would be 25 to 30 years of age. Common problem areas for all people with FASD: learning, social skills, attention, behavior, memory, and memory is a big key thing for employment situations where they would often do so well one day and the next they will forget what it is that has to be done, or anything along that line of, they just forgot how to do such a simple thing, yet they excel the next day. Their language is also affected. You cannot speak to them. You have to use concrete language. You can't just say anything that's figure of speech because they will not get that. And cause and effect thinking we just covered on the slide before here. Now, strategies for helping individuals with FASD. Keep instructions simple and brief, no more than 2 instructions at a time, because if you give them, say, 3 or 5 instructions, they'll only remember the first or the last. Break tasks down into small steps, and that's almost the same as giving them 2 or 3 instructions. Using routines is a major thing. Getting up at a certain time and doing your routine in the morning before heading out the door to attend classes and coming home at the same time. Using routines is definitely what keeps them focused and on task. Teach skills in places where they will be needed. Daniel has had several job opportunities, and his first job was being a dishwasher at Pizza Hut. And when Brian is doing the interview, we'll be learning more about that experience from him. But he definitely was taught that skill, and he does know how to operate a big dishwasher. However, he cannot share that experience at home. So he won't bring it to home. And focusing on their strengths and interests. In his case, his interests and strengths is public speaking and performing. Like, he will do dancing sessions where he's been asked and requested to do that numerous times now. Supervise carefully. Give advance warnings of any change. And he's, looking forward to his major trip coming up March 1st. So we're slowly doing things to get him ready for that. We are having a meeting next Tuesday to discuss his itinerary, and everything is going to be set for him, ready to take off on March 1st for Disneyland. He is going with the Eagles Club at Catholic Social Services in Wetaskiwin, and focusing on their daily living skills. And that is what had him prepare for his adult life today. In junior high, the grades 7, 8, and 9 classes were amalgamated, and they did a lot of the daily living skills, and there was no academic skills there applied for him. And as well as high school, grade 10, 11, and 12 were together in one class, and that was the remedial learning class. So he has been focusing a lot of his time and energy in the past 6-7 years on daily living skills. And the next slide is one of the hardest things to accept in life for a caregiver, any parent, birth parent, foster parent, adopted parent, that there is no cure for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and that the effects of FASD last a lifetime. That is a very hard pill to swallow, and in reality, it's really hard to live with that disability on a daily basis. However, we do our best with all the helpful strategies that would help. Now we're getting into some secondary disabilities or conditions, and those happen when the individual goes through life with this disability and doesn't get recognized, doesn't acknowledge it, does not get assessed. And I've seen that in 4 cases in my own family. I have 4 siblings who are living with this disability, and only one of them has received a diagnosis. They're well into their late 20s and early 30s. So we'll get into things such as experiencing problems at school. They've all dropped out by grade 9. They'll get suspended, or they'll end up quitting because they're frustrated. They don't want to ask questions because, they don't want to seem that they're stupid. I think that's one of the common things that they'll view themselves as being. Or they'll get expelled, and that is with from the teacher or the principal, and that's because they don't understand this disability. They'll experience mental health problems, anxiety, depression, and attempted suicides. Troubles with the law, being in and out of jail. Having alcohol and drug problems themselves, and that is my greatest fear for my son. So far, so good. He is drug and alcohol free. And that is, a lot of that attributes to not having that in our home. I still attend weekly 12-step meetings as often as I can, and so he's around that environment where there is that support and where there is absolutely no drugs and alcohol allowed in our household. And I know when I first was learning about this disability, every time I seen this drug and alcohol problems that they will have that, I was so fearful. And I'm here to say that as long as there isn't anything in the household, they will often not even think of taking that first drink or that first drug. Being homeless, being jobless, and that's, not being able to keep employment. They do find employment. They could talk themselves into getting a job. However, keeping it is another thing, and Brian will talk about that a little bit later on. Having unplanned children, difficulties parenting without support, and early death. And early death is being in a wrong place at the wrong time, and it's usually, in a lot of cases, alcohol-related. Protective factors for reducing these secondary disabilities. Living in a stable and nurturing home for over 72% of life. In Daniel's case, it's been pretty much 100% of his life thus far. Being diagnosed by the age of 6. In Daniel's case, he was diagnosed when he was 6 years old. He was into ECS because he didn't turn 6 until late October, so he couldn't, there was some kind of deadline where he couldn't get into school until that time. So his teacher had automatically took me aside one day when I was parent helper and did tell me that there was something definitely wrong with him, that he couldn't keep still, that he just was hard to handle. They couldn't understand him when he spoke, and that he took off at any time, at any day. Like when the teachers are in front of the classroom, he'll kind of slip away in the back and just disappear. And that was the greatest scare for me. So what we had done was had him assessed, and his first diagnosis was FAE, mild to moderate. That is what they gave him, and that was, 16 years ago. And the reason why he did receive the mild to moderate diagnosis was that I was not honest at all with my own intake. And by the time he was 16, we had him reassessed with the right intake information, and that is where his diagnosis now is partial FAS, alcohol exposed with static encephalopathy. Never having experienced violence against oneself, staying in a living situation for an average of more than 2.8 years, and I believe we're often referring here to child welfare placements. Experiencing a good quality home from the age of 8 to 12 years of age, and in Daniel's case, that's been there for him. Having applied for and been found eligible for supports from persons with developmental disabilities, having a diagnosis of FASD versus FAE, and having basic needs met for at least 13% of life. Prevention of secondary disabilities, the importance of a diagnosis. Assessment and diagnosis requires a multidisciplinary approach. His first assessment took a full day, and the second assessment took 2 full days. And that is, he was seen by at least 6 different individuals, and I myself was being interviewed by a social worker. And then we combined all that information. And of course, the biggest piece to the puzzle is having confirmation of prenatal maternal alcohol use. And often that is hard to get in child welfare cases where the mother is no longer around and you cannot receive that accurate information. Diagnosis provides a blueprint for intervention, and diagnosis by the age of 6 years old increases success for the individual. And I am so proud of Daniel for having graduated from high school back in May of 2008. And to commemorate that event, I went out and had a big family banquet for him to praise him for that and to acknowledge his major achievement. And one of the biggest things that he had wanted to get done or receive was rent a Hummer limo. And that is what we did. He went for a 4-hour drive. By getting help as soon as possible, secondary conditions can be reduced. Now we're getting into what we are here to learn about today, the basic thing that we need, or the most important thing we were being here asked to speak, is what employers need to know about individuals who are affected with this disability. With proper supports and strategies, you will have an excellent employee and coworker. Common traits may include being talkative and being very chatty. They are very good hostesses. They would welcome you in open arms and definitely make you feel welcome, and they'll talk to you about anything. And of course, they will share their stories too, and they often share a little bit more than they need to. But they are quite friendly, very, very friendly and affectionate. They're often curious. They're spontaneous. They love animals. They're generous. They're often very helpful and have the nurturing ability. They're bright in some areas of cognitive development. They're loyal in their friendships, very affectionate, like I said earlier, and are trustworthy and very, very gentle. From common traits to jobs, these common traits are particularly useful in such areas of employment as the hospitality industry, working with plants and animals. And Brian is going to be talking a little bit more about here on working with children.
Excuse me. When we were preparing for this yesterday, I was looking over this material, and working with children is an area that I usually caution people about when you're dealing with people with FASD. And what I'll often say is people with FASD have a hard time taking care of themselves. Why would we put them in situations where they have to take care of people that are vulnerable, which children often are? That being said, I think when we look at work with children for people with FASD, we really want to look at very structured situation where that person is not left alone to work with children all by themselves, and often is not put in a position of absolute authority with children. I think the other factor that we really need to look at when we have people with FASD work with children is we need to know the individual. An example of this is a number of years ago when I worked at the Youth Employment Services Center in Edmonton. I had an 18-year-old client who, through the interview that I had with him and through the assessment process, we discovered in his past he had a habit of offending against children, right? Now, right then and there, I would say he's not a good person to work with children because we have this in his past. Even though he swore that that was over, it was finished, what he couldn't get is how much that would haunt him. His goal for that year was to be a playground supervisor. And unfortunately, that's one of those situations where you're caught in an ethical dilemma. Do I tell the employer or do I not tell the employer? Because, of course, like Annette said, many people with FASD can talk themselves into jobs, but actually have a problem performing the job. So in that case, I actually had to tell the employer this is not a suitable placement for this individual, given his history. He could never understand what happened in the past still affected him in the future, and he could never understand why he didn't get that job. Because, as he would say to me, I love kids. Okay. So that's a caution that I often say is when we work with people with FASD, we really need to take a look at the individual, the job, and whether we can structure and supervise people accordingly in the job. And certainly in situations where you're working with children, we have to be doubly careful to ensure that an individual does not have a pattern of not being able to care for children effectively, or a pattern of offending against children. Okay.
Thank you, Brian. And now we're getting into focusing on their positive traits and not their disability. Some employment skills. Based on common traits, look for skills and abilities in these areas: art, music, gardening, mechanics, construction, athletics. And we've also included areas such as TV remotes, the technical ability in that. They can often just look at that remote and figure it out at ease. And we often wonder where that comes from. It's just something that they could figure out in an instant. And as well as excelling in games such as the Xbox game or the PS2, PS3. They could wrap up a game in a relatively short period of time. And in Daniel's case as well, when he wraps up a game, as he puts it, he's got no more interest in that game because he just, took it to its highest level and it can't get any higher than that. So then he'd have to purchase another new game. That is a skill where the eye-hand coordination is very, very good. And another area for employment possibilities would be working in a place where they sell cell phones and helping the customers set ringtones and figuring out their cell phones, because that's another instant knowledge of ability that Daniel has had. And if we could actually get him to work in a place such as that, I'm sure he would really help a lot of customers. Employment challenges and strategies. Number one challenge, the money, or the memory, I should say, and storytelling, confabulation. The strategy would be to provide step-by-step instructions and ongoing training, as well as provide memory aids and lists, even pictures on the board, or I think that works a lot better than the words. Often pictures will be more helpful. Now, the challenge of comprehension. The strategy would be demonstrations and break down step-by-step instructions. And once again, pictures are helpful. They learn a lot better when it's hand over hand instructions rather than giving them a list of things they have to do, like a whole list, this is how you do it, and that is, something that wouldn't work for them. The other challenge of connecting instructions, words with actions. The strategy would be using plain language, being very repetitious, and avoid figures of speech or sarcasm. The challenge of time management. Strategy would be using calendars and daily planners. And of course, keeping schedule the same as every Monday at a certain time in the afternoon, he will go deliver papers, for example. And that, in fact, is one of his current jobs right now, is delivering the paper on Wednesday afternoons. And resistance to change. The strategy would be keep schedule the same, regular routine, keep environment quiet and free from distractions. The boundaries and behavior. The strategy would be using a buddy system, always have supervision, and mentoring if possible. With his first job working at Pizza Hut, he was given a job coach through Catholic Social Services in Wetaskiwin, and that really was very helpful for him. The job coach would pick him up, stay with him on site, and then bring him home. And that was something that was very helpful and useful. But there were times when the job coach figured that he didn't need the help, where he was just dropped off and then picked up later. And that did not work, because there were times when he did need that extra help and they weren't there to help him. So he did struggle and run into some situations that weren't favorable. Now some considerations. The wisdom of a father. These slides were taken from a book called Letters to Our Children and Letters from Our Children. The wisdom of a father, and it also applies into any kind of life situation, especially in employment situations, of things to know and understand about an individual who is affected with this disability. Be mad at what happened to cause FASD and not the person who gave birth. Acknowledge the child's feelings, or the young adult. A young adult who sees an angry adult will stay defiant. Remember the things he or she has done were impulsive. Validate that the young adult has a role in the relationship and do it before they forget. It is hard on the young adult to have many caregivers. These children, young adults, present many challenges while struggling every day to do their best. Strengths need to be emphasized over weaknesses. Validating strength builds a more positive relationship, and believe in the individual. They will succeed through their own perseverance and determination. The wisdom of a mother caregiver. To those working with young adults and or children who are FASD affected, be prepared. Of course, number one, the biggest thing is to advocate. And even though Daniel is going to be 22 here this year, he often tells me that he does not appreciate it or like it when I don't speak on his behalf, like when he does all the talking, because he just can't seem to vocalize things as clearly as what he would intend to, and so I'm still there. And because of his disability, he has got that speech delay and language problems. His palate was greatly affected, and oftentimes it's hard for us to communicate still today, and some of the words he cannot pronounce clearly. He had suggested that we take sign language course, which we did at his request. I mean, I wouldn't have even thought of it. But he wanted to take this sign language course so we could help each other if need be. And it was a real interesting course to take. I would like to take it again, because it was about 4 years ago that we took this sign language. But yes, I have advocated for him right from grade 3 on to high school. To be interrupted if you are doing something, to make never-ending lists, to check the bus stop daily, did they even get on that bus, to check the lost and found weekly. They're often quite generous, and they would give anything away. If anybody really admired what they had, they would often give that away if they could. To look in the school bag for notes. He's getting better at giving me notes, even from the Horizon Center. They will give notes to him to pass on to me and things I need to know. For example, the Valentine's dance that's happening this Friday night. which he doesn't want me to go with him to, but but it is there. That event is scheduled for this Friday. To investigate silence. Often when I know that there's something occupying his mind, he will keep quiet about it, and I often have to ask questions, and finally he will tell me what that is. But investigating silence is a big thing for me. To read between the lines, to sound like a broken record, and that's often in the mornings where, make sure you brush your teeth, and there used to be times when I had to say that at least 10 times before it actually was done. To smile when others frown. And also to please understand that yes doesn't mean it'll happen. Your sense of humor will often be tested. I don't know is often the truth, and that's usually when they're asked the big why question of why did you do that, or why did that happen, and the first response is I don't know. And that really is the truth for them. They are speaking truthfully. The bus leaves at a certain time with or without them. Compliance doesn't mean they will remember the next time. And every time the school calls, it isn't bad news. What you think should happen probably won't happen. You have needs too. Support and relief are real words, and you can't control their behavior, but you can control your response. And that is one of the hardest things for me to do at times, is, I can't control my response. And be thankful that your children are delightful and very unique. Your life will never be dull. U-turns are allowed on dead-end streets. You are not alone. They depend on you, they love you, and oh, the joy of never-ending parenting. And I think at this time we will be bringing Daniel forward for an interview. Come on, Daniel.
In your handout, you do have a handout of questions that I use to sort of get information from people who have FASD, who are either diagnosed. Most of my clients primarily are undiagnosed. I'll move up closer. So I developed this for the people at ADAC who wanted to get some information. Okay. Who often needed some assistance with people in sort of screening them to see who they would suspect might be alcohol affected. That's there for your use, and it's certainly something I encourage people to do when they're interviewing people, is to do a comprehensive, structured assessment of an individual and to ask more questions. In fact, what I often say to people, it's the unasked question that often is the one that sinks the ship when we're working with people with FASD. So I've had the opportunity to work with Daniel for the last couple of years. I've known Daniel and his mom for a number of years as I've seen them speak. So what we do as part of our sessions on employability is we talk to Daniel about his life and try to get to know him a little bit better. So that's what we're going to do today. And we'll be passing the microphone, and I also will involve his mom, because I think when you're working with people with FASD, you want to have multiple sources of information. You want to interview the individual themselves, but you also want to interview the caregiver, because the caregivers can often fill in information that the individual can't give us. So, thank you for coming today, Daniel. How are you doing today?
Good.
Okay. So, when we talked yesterday, you were telling me that you were currently at the Horizon Center, right?
Yep.
And how often do you go to the Horizon Center?
I only go there 4 days. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday.
Okay. And what the Horizon Center is trying to give you some skills. What are they doing with you right now? What are they teaching you?
On Wednesday at noon, I go deliver newspapers.
Okay. And do you do anything else for them?
I go to Boys and Girl Club.
Okay. And what do you do at the Boys and Girl Club?
I used to mop the floor before, but I'm mine, and now I'm putting the garbage away and wiping the window and glass and the mirror.
Okay, so you're basically kind of making sure the place looks really good, right?
Yeah.
Taking out the garbage, kind of making sure the floor is nice and clean, and then the windows you can see out of them in the mirror, right? Okay. Daniel, so you've got those two things happening that relate to work. I know you've had some jobs in the past. Can you tell me what jobs you've done in the past?
Yeah.
Sure.
I work in Pizza Hut, and in my work experience in school, I worked Boston Pizza and Walmart.
Okay, and which was your favorite job?
Boston Pizza,
And why was that your favorite job?
because I stacked some chicken finger and fries and hot wing, and I was helping with my Uncle Chad making pizza and everything, and this one nice woman, she gave me a free pizza.
Okay, so you were working with your uncle,
Yeah.
and they gave you a job that was fun to do,
Yeah.
and they even rewarded you. That person gave you a free pizza.
Yeah.
Okay, and what do you think was your least favorite job? Which one was the hardest job?
Probably Walmart.
Walmart.
Yeah,
And why was Walmart hard for you?
because I had to stack milk all the time. It's so heavy.
Okay, so stacking milk was really hard for you.
Yeah, and sometimes I put the milk away. The bleacher, I always get scratch on it, and
Okay.
my hand get bleed sometimes.
Okay. And yesterday you told me it was kind of like when you needed help in the job, you always had to go find somebody, right?
Yep.
They were never around you when you were working.
No.
And you also told me in the past you didn't like working in the cold, in the freezer.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
But it kind of feel cool when it was hot outside in summer. Yeah. But I didn't like it working in the fridge in winter time.
Okay. So you didn't care for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Right now, with the Horizon Center, do they want you to try some work experience at different
Yeah.
places? Where would they like you to work at?
But they want me to work at Walmart, but I told them no.
Okay.
I have enemies work there.
Okay, so you have enemies working for
Yeah.
Walmart. Okay, so they would like you to work at Walmart.
But I told them I don't want to work there. If I work there, I might get frustrated to that person, and I might get mad at her or swear at her or do bad
Okay.
thing. So
Okay.
so I don't want to work there.
Okay, so you told them that
Yeah.
Walmart's not a good place because
No.
there's a person there that isn't your friend,
Yeah,
and if you were working there, you might get frustrated.
yeah, and I might yell at her and everything.
Okay, okay. And what did they say when they heard that? Were they okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they thank you for telling me that.
That they did. They said thank you for telling
Yeah.
them that. Okay. Have they also thought about other places to have you work, Daniel?
They want me to work at Pizza Hut, but I told them no.
Okay. Now you worked at Pizza Hut before, right? And how long did you work at Pizza Hut?
3 years.
3 years.
I think.
3 years. Okay. And what were they having you do at Pizza Hut? What did you do for them?
Dishes.
You did dishes.
Yeah.
And you held that job for 3 years,
Yeah.
which is pretty good. Yeah. And tell me a little bit about how that job ended. What happened when
I quit there.
you quit there?
Yeah, because the boss was yelling at me, and so I quit.
Okay. So you were telling us that yesterday, that the
Yeah.
boss sometimes yelled at you and
Yeah.
you didn't like that.
No.
Do you remember what happened on the day you quit?
Because I got there late, and my mom told him I worked there very late, and nobody never told me.
Okay. So you got to work late.
Yeah.
And I think your mom can kind of fill some of this story in for us if you want to kind of tell a little bit about how Daniel's job ended at Pizza Hut. Sure.
Okay, what happened in that instance was his job coach did not pick him up. However, it was his word against Daniel's word. And so Daniel was about 20 minutes late for work. So I took him to work and I spoke to the manager and said, the coach didn't pick him up. And his response was, well, he did go pick him up and he wouldn't come out of the house. But I said, well, could he work late? Like, I will pick him up. I think he worked from 5 till 7. So I said it was 20 after 5. I said, let him work from 5:30 to 7:30. So I failed to tell Daniel that, and the manager also failed to tell Daniel that. And so at 7 o'clock, Daniel went to punch out. And his worker kind of yelled at him and told him to get back to work. And Daniel just said, well, I quit, meaning I quit the shift. And the manager thought he quit permanently. Like, I quit today, like, forget it, I'm not going to come back. And that wasn't the case. And we were planning on giving the 2-week notice. We called the next day and asked, we'd like to provide a 2-week notice. And the manager said, well, forget it, he already quit. He did say he was quitting, so he doesn't have to come back. So that wasn't a very good situation at that time.
Okay, so it was a situation where you had made the arrangements with the employer, but forgot to tell Daniel, and it sort of kind of just went kind of wrong from there, Did you like that job at Pizza Hut?
No.
You didn't, eh?
No.
What didn't you like about it?
I don't really like doing dishes.
You don't really like doing dishes?
No.
And it seemed to me that they gave you lots of dishes to do there, didn't they? Okay. Daniel, if you think about your future, this is a hard question, okay? Are there any types of jobs that you would like to try? Anything that you thought about that you'd like to try?
Probably working at McDonald's.
So maybe working at McDonald's?
And try to work at cashier.
Okay, that's one you've told me before, cashier.
Yeah.
Okay, and so those are a couple of job ideas that you have for yourself, right?
Yep.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your life, not work-related. Tell me what kind of things do you like to do? What are your interests?
I bowl at every Thursday.
Every Thursday.
Yeah,
you bowl?
I play 10-pin.
You play 10-pin.
Yeah, I used to play 5-pin, but now I play 10-pin.
Okay.
Yeah, and my most high score is in 10-pin is 150.
150.
Yeah.
Right, and you're a pretty good bowler, aren't you?
Yeah.
Right, because you even went to the Special Olympics for bowling, didn't you?
And 2 weeks ago, I finally got 3 strikes in a row.
Okay.
Church.
3 strikes in a row.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty good. And tell me a little bit about other things that you like to do. What are your other hobbies?
I like to play my game.
Okay.
I got PS2, PS3, and an Xbox 360.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you've got lots of games,
Yeah.
right? And you're pretty good at it, right? And like you said, like your mom was saying earlier, when you wrap a game, you can get to the highest level pretty quickly,
Yeah.
and then you're done with it. You move on to another game, right? Okay. How about other things that you're interested in? Do you like movies?
Yeah.
Okay, what kind of movies do you like?
I watch the show and drama and action and comedy.
Okay, so you like scary shows.
Yeah.
Now I know before you told me your mother doesn't like scary shows, so you watch them by yourself.
Yeah.
You like drama, you like action, and you like comedy.
Yeah.
Okay. And you like to perform, don't you, Daniel?
Yeah.
Okay. What kind of things do you like to do when you perform?
I dance.
Okay.
Yeah. My song is the Black Eyed Peas, I Got a Feeling.
Okay. Well, that's a pretty good song,
Yeah.
isn't it? So you like to perform, you like to dance.
Yeah.
Okay. You also like to tell jokes in that.
Yeah.
Because I remember when we were down in Calgary, you were telling us that you'd really like to be an actor someday.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. So there's another area that we possibly can explore with you to
Okay.
give you a chance, to try to do some performance in that. Cool. And what was that joke that you always tell to our group?
Okay.
You want to tell it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. every time I go to Derek Starlight, he tells a puppet show. Really funny. His name is Warrior Hunter Muffet. In Toronto. So Warrior Hunter, how many kids you have? 4 kids. So what's their name? Their name are Eenie, Meenie, Mun, and Fred. I have 2 more. Oh, my wife don't have no more.
Okay. That always gets everybody when we interview Daniel in our groups. What do you think about your future, Daniel? Do you like living where you're living right now? Okay, so you're happy at living with your mom in Wetaskiwin?
Yeah.
And do you have any plans for your future at this point? Or
Yeah.
what would you like to do in your future?
But I'm planning to go to Disneyland.
Okay, that's your short term. So
Yeah.
you're going to be going to Disneyland. Okay, and when's that going to happen?
And March 1st.
March 1st?
Yep.
Okay, and that's something that you've saved up for the last few years, right?
Yep.
Okay, and so you're going to go down there. Okay, here's the loaded question. Is your mom going with you on that trip?
No.
Okay, so that one you're going to do with a group of people.
Yeah.
What is it, the Eagles Club in Wetaskiwin?
Eagle Club.
Okay, good. Can you think of anything else you want to tell us about yourself, Daniel? Okay, you're going to go to Disneyland.
Yeah.
Okay, you've done some traveling before, haven't you? You've been to Disneyland,
Yeah.
is it once or twice? One other time?
Yeah.
Okay, and you've been on a cruise, haven't you?
In a boat.
In the boat?
Yeah.
Did you like that one?
Yeah.
That was okay? Cool, good. And who's your favorite hockey team?
Calgary Flame and Edmonton Oilers.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this year the Flames are doing better than the Oilers, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well,
And-
enough said about hockey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it's a playoff, when Calgary Flame don't make the playoff, I just cheer the Edmonton Oilers
Okay,
on a playoff.
and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a complex term.
Yeah.
So if Edmonton makes the playoff, you'll cheer from them, but that's
Yeah.
not going to happen this year, right? Okay, good. Well, listen, thank you once again for kind of being a good interview guy,
Okay.
right? I'm glad to hear about your work at the Horizon Center, that they've given you some things to do.
Yeah.
How is it doing the newspapers? Is that an easy job for you or a hard job?
Easy.
Very
Yeah.
easy? And how about the Boys and Girls Club? Is that an easy or a
Yeah.
hard job?
I work really fast, and I'm the first one done.
Okay. And you had another job before that. You were telling me where you had to kind of...
I work in CHIP.
Okay, at CHIPS.
At the little playground thing, and I had to put the thing together.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
had to... It was a playground
Yeah.
for children, and your job was to put together some of the equipment.
Yeah.
And then at the end of take it apart, kind of store it away.
Yeah.
Okay, and you like taking it apart better than putting it together, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. The putting it together was a bit difficult, wasn't it? Okay. And what did you do about that? You told them enough of that job, right? And they listened to you.
Yeah.
And that was good. That was good. And then they gave you another job to do.
Yep.
Okay. Good. Maybe I'm going to have your mom talk a little bit. When we were going through this yesterday and talking with Daniel, we kind of learned a few things, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Daniel, when he's kind of had jobs, has had support through some job coaches in the past, hasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. And what did we learn yesterday about the job coaching?
Well, what we learned from Daniel sharing with us was some of them would just drop him off and then pick him up. Like they wouldn't just stay there and supervise him or just stay to see if he needed some extra help. And that was something brand new that I had just learned yesterday, just by interviewing and talking to Daniel.
Yep. And what we learned yesterday is that he had a job coach that actually stayed with him during his shift. And one of the things I'll tell most people, job coaching is a really good strategy to use with people with FAS, right? It really helps them work to their capacity. So he had one job coach who actually stayed with you during the job. And actually every once in a while she would say, do you need some help in doing things?
Yeah.
You know, and would she help you when that happened?
Yeah.
She would. So that was at Pizza Hut, right? So she would help you do the dishes.
Yeah.
And were you kind of open to the help, or what would you say to her?
I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, you said no thank you. I
Yeah.
can do it?
Yeah.
Okay. So it sounded like she actually stayed for the entire shift, whereas other job coaches dropped Daniel off, left him to do the work by himself, and then picked him up. So, or they would go for coffee or something like that. Okay, here's the thing about job coaching, right, that I think your job coach should be with you for your entire shift, right? They shouldn't necessarily just kind of leave it all up to you. They should be helping you do your job and do your tasks. Okay. Annette, when you think about Daniel's future, what kind of things would you like to have happen for Daniel, let's say, in the future?
Well, we have talked about this quite a few times, but he's not quite prepared and ready for it, is to move here to Edmonton and attend the, Horizon Center, but Cunningham Place. And that is a facility that would assist him the best because he could stay there for up to 3 years. And it's for young adults from the ages of 18 to 30. They would be assigned their very own counselor who would help them get an education, post-secondary, or get a job. And I'm not sure when Daniel would be ready for that. Like, he is going to be 22, and like 30 is going to be coming around the corner there pretty soon. And the only requirement that they ask is that they be alcohol and drug free. So that would be my goal, and I hope someday he would like to do that. But right, I'm in really no rush to have him go out on his own yet. He thinks he would be ready around 25, and I think that's about the right time frame for him.
Okay, so you've sort of talked about this with Daniel and about maybe kind of do some future planning and kind of planting seeds, kind of moving him forward in his own time, right?
Yes.
So you would like that to happen, and you're just kind of waiting for Daniel to tell you he's ready. I know one thing that we've talked about, that if he gets into the city, one thing that we might try is something like a transitional vocational program for Daniel, because it would have some structured work experience and be very much a continuation of what he's done at the Horizon Center.
Yes.
So that might be something that we want to look at from a point of view of employment for Daniel in the future.
Yes.
Right. Can you share anything else about Daniel? Any kind of other stories that you have about Daniel and work and life?
He's just looking at me there, trying to say, don't tell that one. But I'm going to tell it anyway. We had some extra speech therapy one year as I kept him back in grade 6 because he was, to me, too small and petite to go on into junior high. So I asked and requested that he be kept an extra year to develop his speech. And so we did that. And during this homework time, I went with him one day to get this work checked. And what the speech therapist would do is have him work on a particular sound and then have the word on a piece of paper. And he'd have to say that certain word over and over till he pronounced it quite clearly. And that particular day, the word was TH. So then he had to, roll his tongue and say th, I don't know how many times. And the word had to be thong. And he said the word a few times. Thong, thong. And then she gave him a moment or two and said, okay, Daniel, do you have a sentence using this word? And he kind of looked at me, and then he looked at her, and then he kind of smiled at me, and I'm thinking, oh, God. Oh, no. And then she looked at him, are you ready, Daniel? Mm-hmm. It was, what is your sentence? My mom wears a thong. And we just kind of looked at each other. And then she goes, she wears one on each foot, right? And he said, yeah, I guess so. But yes, we did have that experience, which we will never forget. I'm sure she will never forget that either. And we did have a lot of extra homework to do to help him because all speech therapists, I think, are overworked. Like they have, I think she had over 100 files. So it was good for us to get that added homework and that added chance to see her on a weekly basis. But that's one story for Daniel that we talk about or mention from time to time. And the other one was, yes, the other day I shared in Calgary at closing, which is one of the highlights in his determination and everything in getting recognized or not feeling part of, like for him to be involved in a school class setting. He was in daycare, and it was at a Christmas concert, and they did not want him to be a part of it because he could not sing the songs, like he couldn't pronounce the words, and so they left him out. And he'd been practicing this carol, Christmas carol, so he couldn't understand that. He sat there waiting to be up on stage to sing with the group, and he noticed then that the concert was over and he hadn't gone up to sing yet. So he took it upon himself to get up on stage and sing that carol, and he sang it. You couldn't understand a word he said, but you knew what he was singing by the tune of that certain carol. And I knew then that nobody could hold him back if he wanted to do anything. That was just a small example at such a young age, that if he's determined to do something and he's told that he couldn't do it, he will make a point of doing it one way or the other. And I think that is why he likes entertaining these days, is to be in front of people and to be in the spotlight.
And so there is hope for that acting career in there. He's it's interesting. Annette often will show photos of Daniel through his lifespan, and we have some of them here in the presentation. But I always say Daniel is the type of guy, he's never met a camera that he doesn't like. He's very photogenic, and he does like to perform, don't you, Daniel? Yep. Okay, cool. I think if we have some time, we'll open it up to some questions. This is, of course, the first part of our presentation. The next part of our presentation in March, we're going to deal more specifically with employment. The first part is kind of going through a lot of the basics about FASD, but with a spin on it to kind of look at how it affects a person's employability. And of course, we always like people to meet Daniel because he is such a unique guy. One thing I will say, and this is credit to both Daniel and his mom, is that they've worked very hard to get an excellent result for this young man. And I was saying to Annette, when we looked at the protective factors, it's kind of like you can do a checklist, and Daniel's had almost every protective factor available. And like Annette says, one of her main jobs is to be not only Daniel's mom, but his chief advocate. What I will tell you with my clients that I see, I've seen over 1,000 people who are affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. The ones who do the best are the ones who have at least one advocate. And usually that advocate is going to be a birth parent, a foster parent, an adoptive parent, right? So the ones without advocates invariably do worse, right? And I really have to give Annette a lot of credit for kind of structuring Daniel's life to get a good outcome. Because what I'm seeing with adults who are affected by FASD is this is the rarer outcome. I'll talk more about that when we're together on March 11th, and I'll talk about what I think we can do to enhance employability. So if there are any questions, let's open it up and see what you guys think, and any questions for Annette and Daniel, we'll be glad to take them, and for myself as well too. Sure.
I was interested, Brian, in your comment about the dilemma that you had in relation to sharing some information with the employer that was confidential information and would violate your client's privacy. Can you say a little bit more about that and how you deal with that with the client and also with the employer or whoever it is that you're sharing the information with?
Sure. You know, of course, most of us who work for government have to work under the Freedom of Information and Privacy Protection Act, which means that sometimes it's kind of an ethical dilemma. What can we share and what can't we share? You know, now what became evident is my client at that point had a history of offending against children, right? And the initial step was to try to work with him to get him to see that the job was not the appropriate job because of this. He never got that idea. He always felt that I can work with children because I am good with children, and that was in the past. And you'll often get this with people with FASD, is that their sense of things continuing into the future is impaired. So that's the past. Why are we even talking about it? What I eventually had to do was I phoned the employer, and without disclosing the issue, I said, just so you know, when you're interviewing this person, I'm his career counselor. I do not think this is an appropriate job for this young person, right? And then what I did is worked on kind of looking at some other jobs for him, which we did kind of get him more into construction laboring, which was always his second choice. But he never got the idea that because he had a history of offending against children when he was in care, that it wasn't a good idea to work with children. He's kind of an interesting guy. He pops back in. This is one thing I'll say about people with FAS have a tendency to pop back into your life at crucial points. So I saw him when he was 18. I saw him when he was 26. And I saw him, recently, and he's almost 30 now. And usually he comes in for a very discreet service. He says, this is what I need to do. I need to get a resume done, or I need to do this. His work history is very checkered, mostly in laboring. He's kind of moved away from childcare as an area, and that's my concern with people with FASD and working with children is about some of those issues. And I often will say, if we have adults with FASD who can hardly take care of themselves, how can we have them work with the most vulnerable people in our society, which are children? So I hope that answers your question.
I just carrying that a little bit further, have you ever been in a situation where your client was aware that you shared information? And if so, how did that affect your relationship with them?
Well, in that case, I did not share that information with my client. And I think what really motivated me not to share it is I think it would have destroyed sort of a career counseling relationship. He would have, in his mind, it would be a betrayal of trust. What I was motivated by is the idea that if we have him working with children, there's a chance he could offend against children. And so I, in a discreet way, said to the employer, this is not a suitable job. I haven't had too many where I've had clients where I've actually had to go and talk with employers about their disabilities. Say, here are some things you need to watch out for on the job. If you see this happening, this is what it's due to. And most of the time, clients are okay in that case, like sharing some. And in fact, they look at it as a type of advocacy for them, kind of setting the parameters of the job well for them. So I can't say that I've had a lot of ones where I've had such an ethical dilemma as that. It's more been kind of doing more advocacy work for the individual and the employer. Yep. If there are no other questions, I think we'll turn it back to Judy and kind of finish the session.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for the great presentation, Annette and Brian, and thank you, Daniel, for coming to the presentation today and letting us get to know you a little better. This presentation was very informative and outlines the challenges and strategies for enhancing employability for persons with FASD. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and please notice that evaluations will be mailed to participants within the next 2 business days. So please be sure to sign the attendance list because that's our contact information of where we'll be sending them to you. Your feedback of this session is very important to us, and our next session on employment strategies is scheduled for Thursday, March the 11th from 9 till 11. So we hope to see you at that one. Thank you very much. Okay.